In a small-town diner in Millfield, an elderly man was about to order a simple bowl of soup. What should have been an ordinary lunch turned deadly quiet when a young waiter humiliated him in front of the entire room. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical traveler stopping for coffee. For decades, he was a martial artist, soldier, and screen legend known worldwide for his unshakable discipline and the kind of calm that only came from surviving real battles. When the arrogant waiter mocked the old man and tried to force him out, he had no idea he was provoking the one man who had built a career and a life defending the vulnerable. Chuck Norris stood, removed his hat, and with quiet authority triggered a chain reaction that would ripple through every soul in the diner. What began as an old man's quiet humiliation would become a lesson in dignity and courage. The town of Millfield would never be the same after witnessing the moment Chuck Norris decided enough was enough. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sunrise Diner sat at the heart of Millfield like an anchor, steady amid the town's constant changes. Morning sunlight streamed through large windows, casting golden rectangles across the checkered floor. The lunch rush had begun, bringing with it the symphony of small-town life, silverware clinking against ceramic plates, coffee being poured into waiting mugs, and the gentle hum of conversation rising and falling like waves. Fran, a waitress who'd worked there since the Reagan administration, wove between tables with practiced grace. "Order up for table 7, she called, balancing 3 plates along her arm with the confidence of someone who'd done it 10,000 times before. In the corner booth, a man sat alone, his hat pulled low, face partially hidden beneath its brim. His hands, weathered but steady, cradled a mug of black coffee. He hadn't ordered food, just the coffee, which he'd been nursing for nearly 30 minutes. No one paid him much attention, just another traveler passing through, keeping to himself. The bell above the door chimed, and a collective shift in attention followed. Not because the newcomer commanded it, but because of his conspicuous lack of demanding anything at all. An elderly man stood in the entrance, hesitating as though unsure of his welcome. His clothes were clean but threadbare, patches visible on his jacket elbows. His face carried deep lines, each one etched by time and hardship, but his eyes held a quiet dignity that stood at odds with his appearance. "Just one?" asked Sandy, the hostess, with professional courtesy. The old man nodded, removing his worn cap. "Yes, ma'am. Just me today." Sandy guided him to a small table near the center of the diner. The old man moved slowly, each step deliberate, as though conserving energy for what mattered most. He lowered himself into the chair, with a barely audible sigh of relief. From behind the counter, Mike Wheeler, the diner's owner, watched with practiced neutrality. The Sunrise served everyone: working folks, business people, and those down on their luck. Mike prided himself on running a place where all were treated the same, though he rarely enforced this philosophy personally, preferring to let his staff handle customer interactions. Jason, the newest waiter, eyed the old man from across the room while refilling waters at a family's table. 22, and convinced the world owed him more than a job serving breakfast, Jason carried his dissatisfaction like a badge. 3 months into the job, he'd already developed a reputation for efficiency without warmth, for service without sincerity. "Can I take your order?" The young waiter's voice cut through the diner's ambient noise as he approached the old man's table, order pad in hand but pen conspicuously still. "Just some soup, please," the old man replied, looking up with a gentle smile. "And maybe some water." Jason didn't write anything down. Instead, he shifted his weight, glancing toward a table of better-dressed patrons who had just been seated. "Soup's $5.95, he said flatly. "You got money for that?" The words landed like stones in still water. Nearby conversations faltered. A woman at the next table lowered her fork. The rhythm of the diner, so natural moments before, stuttered. The old man's smile faded, but he maintained his composure. "Yes, I have money," he said, reaching slowly for his pocket. "I wouldn't have asked otherwise." Jason's eyebrows raised slightly. "Just checking. We get all types in here." The implication hung heavy in the air. In the corner, the man with the hat raised his head slightly. For the first time, his eyes were visible beneath the brim, sharp, alert, and focused entirely on the interaction unfolding before him. "Been a while since I've seen you in here," Jason continued, making no move to write down the order. "Last time, didn't you just order coffee and sit for 3 hours?" The old man's shoulders curved inward slightly. "That was a different day," he said softly. "Today I'd like some soup, please." A few tables away, a family of 4 exchanged uncomfortable glances. The father half rose, as if to say something, then slowly sank back into his seat when his wife touched his arm. The mother shielded her children's eyes from the scene with a deliberate question about their homework. "We're pretty busy," Jason said, gesturing around the diner. "Might be a while before the soup's ready. Sure you don't want to try somewhere else?" His voice carried just enough for nearby tables to hear. The old man looked down at his gnarled hands, now resting on the table. They were the hands of someone who had worked hard his entire life, who had built and repaired and provided. Now they trembled slightly. "I can wait," he said, his voice softer, but still steady. "I don't mind." Mike Wheeler, watching from behind the counter, frowned slightly, but remained rooted in place. He'd have a word with Jason later, maybe, when there weren't so many customers around. Business was business after all, and confrontation was bad for business. The man in the corner slowly set his coffee mug down. The sound was barely audible, yet somehow it carried across the diner. 3 tables away, a young woman looked up, then followed his gaze to the old man and the waiter. For a moment, she seemed about to speak, but the words died before reaching her lips. "Sure. Whatever," Jason finally said, with a shrug that dismissed not just the order, but the man himself. "One soup. When the kitchen gets around to it." He walked away without writing anything down, making a show of hurrying to the better-dressed patron's table with a suddenly wide smile. "Welcome to Sunrise. What can I get started for you folks today?" The old man sat still, his dignity wrapped around him like armor. Thin, but intact. He kept his eyes on his hands, avoiding the glances, some pitying, some embarrassed, some deliberately averted from other diners. In small towns, humiliation is a communal experience, shared among witnesses whether they wish to participate or not. From his corner booth, the man with the hat watched everything unfold with unwavering attention. His face remained impassive, but something had changed in his posture. A subtle straightening of the spine, a deliberate stillness that spoke of decision rather than hesitation. The diner's rhythm gradually resumed. Conversations returned, silverware clinked against plates, and the hiss of the espresso machine punctuated it all. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. An invisible line had been drawn. And one man in the corner had decided it would not stand. The old man reached for the glass of water Jason had grudgingly delivered. Several minutes later, his hand trembled slightly, causing tiny ripples to spread across the surface. He didn't complain. He didn't cause a scene. He simply waited with the patience of someone who had learned over many years that dignity often required endurance. In the corner, the man with the hat took one last sip of his coffee and set the mug down with quiet finality. 20 minutes passed. The lunch rush intensified, with nearly every table occupied. Waitresses hurried between the kitchen and dining room, balancing plates and refilling coffee cups. The cash register chimed steadily as satisfied customers paid their bills and left, making room for new arrivals. Through it all, the old man sat quietly, still waiting for his soup. Across the diner, Jason moved with theatrical efficiency, taking orders, delivering food, flashing practiced smiles at customers who looked like good tippers. Each time he passed the old man's table, he conspicuously avoided eye contact. From the kitchen doorway, Louisa, the cook, watched with growing concern. "Hey!" she called to Jason as he picked up an order. "What about the soup for table 4? Jason rolled his eyes. "Oh yeah, almost forgot. Old timer probably fell asleep anyway." He grabbed a bowl from the window, not bothering with a tray, and approached the old man's table. "Here," he said, setting the bowl down with enough force that some of the soup sloshed over the edge. "Anything else?" The old man looked up, his eyes bright despite everything. "Thank you. Could I have a spoon, please?" Jason patted his pockets with exaggerated movements. "Don't have one on me. I'll grab one when I get a chance." He turned away, then paused, looking back. "By the way, we're getting pretty full. Try not to take all day. Okay?" The remark landed in the diner like a slap. A woman at a nearby table gasped softly. At the counter, Mike Wheeler finally looked up from his paperwork, frowning, but still said nothing. The old man nodded, his expression unchanged. "I understand, I won't be long." In the corner booth, the man with the hat shifted slightly. Anyone watching might have noticed how his hand tightened around his empty coffee mug, the knuckles whitening for just a moment before relaxing again. Two young women at a window table exchanged whispers. One of them half rose, a spoon in her hand, clearly intending to bring it to the old man. Before she could move, Jason reappeared with a tray of drinks for another table. "Oh, still waiting on that spoon?" he asked loudly as he passed. "Sorry about that. We're swamped." He didn't break stride or look back. The young woman slowly sat back down, her cheeks flushing with second-hand embarrassment and guilt. "Excuse me." The old man's voice, though soft, carried to the nearby tables. "I don't mean to be a bother, but I really would appreciate a spoon." A business-suited man at the next table glanced over, then quickly looked away, suddenly fascinated by his phone. A family with 2 children kept their eyes fixed on their plates. No one wanted to involve themselves, to acknowledge what was happening just feet away. Jason reappeared, this time with a spoon held between 2 fingers, as if reluctant to touch it fully. "Here you go," he said, dropping it on the table rather than handing it properly. "Enjoy your soup. Should still be warm. Mostly." The old man picked up the spoon. "Thank you," he said, his dignity intact, despite everything. "Yeah, well." Jason hovered, lowering his voice but still loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Just so you know, we've got a minimum purchase amount if you're going to take up a table during rush hour. Soup might not cut it." The old man's hand paused halfway to the bowl. "I didn't know that," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I can order something else as well." "Now he tells me," Jason said to no one in particular. Then louder, addressing the old man again. "Kitchen's backed up. You'd be waiting another half hour at least." He leaned closer. "Look, maybe it's best if you just have your soup and move along. There's a shelter 3 blocks down that serves lunch until 2. The words hung in the air like smoke. There was no shelter. Everyone local knew it. The implication was clear: the old man didn't belong here, among normal people with homes and jobs and money. At a nearby table, a mother quickly distracted her curious child who had been watching the scene unfold. "Eyes on your own plate, honey," she whispered. though she herself couldn't help glancing over. The old man's shoulders slumped slightly, but he raised his chin. "I'm not looking for charity," he said, his voice steady despite the public humiliation. "I have money to pay for my meal." "Sure you do?" Jason said with a smirk. "Well, just finish up quick, okay? We've got people waiting who—" He stopped himself, but the unspoken words were clear enough. "People who matter more than you." In the corner booth, the man with the hat slowly set his coffee mug down with a soft but deliberate click against the table. For the first time since he'd entered the diner, he shifted in his seat, turning his body fully toward the unfolding scene. Still, he made no move to rise, watching with patient intensity. The old man picked up his spoon again, hand trembling more visibly now. He dipped it into the soup, but before he could take a bite, Jason was back. "Almost forgot," the waiter said loudly, dropping a check on the table. "Just so you know what you're in for. We don't do tabs for, you know, walk-ins." The old man stared at the check. "But I haven't even started eating yet." "Restaurant policy," Jason lied smoothly. "Nothing personal." A few tables away, a balding man in a business suit muttered something to his companion about people who can't afford to eat out. Shouldn't. The woman with him nodded, though she had the decency to look uncomfortable about it. Mike Wheeler finally stepped out from behind the counter, moving toward the situation, but slowly, reluctantly, like someone approaching a mess they hoped would somehow clean itself up before they arrived. The old man reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it carefully, fingers working with deliberate precision, despite their slight tremor. He withdrew several bills, neatly folded, and placed them on the table beside the untouched soup. "I think I've lost my appetite," he said quietly, preparing to stand. "Thank you for your time." "Hey! No hard feelings," Jason said with false cheerfulness. "Just doing my job." From several tables, eyes watched the old man gather his dignity around himself like a cloak, preparing to leave hungry rather than endure further humiliation. And that was when the sound of a chair scraping against the floor cut through the diner's atmosphere. The man in the corner booth stood up. He took one step forward, then another, each footfall deliberate and unhurried. As he moved into the light from the windows, he reached up and removed his hat. The atmosphere in the diner changed instantly. Recognition spread across faces like a wave. It was Chuck Norris. Time seemed to slow as Chuck Norris crossed the diner floor. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove and no need to hurry. His gaze never wavered from the scene before him, the old man, half risen from his chair, and Jason, the waiter, whose smirk was beginning to falter. Conversations throughout the diner faded to whispers, then to silence. Forks paused midway to mouths. Coffee cups hovered above saucers. Every eye tracked Chuck's measured progress across the checkered floor. The old man, unaware of what was happening behind him, continued his preparations to leave, carefully tucking his wallet back into his pocket. His movements were deliberate, maintaining what dignity he could in the face of such public humiliation. Jason noticed the change in the room first, the sudden quiet, the shift in attention. He looked up, annoyed at having his moment interrupted, and froze when he saw Chuck approaching. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by confusion. "Is there a problem here?" Chuck asked, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry throughout the now silent diner. He didn't direct the question to anyone in particular, but his eyes, steady and piercing, focused on Jason. The waiter's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "No problem," he said, his voice slightly higher than before. Just handling a customer situation. The old man turned, surprised by the new voice, and found himself looking up at Chuck Norris. Unlike many in the diner, he showed no sign of recognition, just polite curiosity at the interruption. "I don't want to cause any trouble," the old man said softly. "I was just leaving." Chuck studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Jason. "Bring this man a fresh bowl of soup," he said. It wasn't a request. Jason hesitated, caught between his earlier behavior and the unmistakable authority in Chuck's voice. "We're really busy." And he was just... "A fresh bowl of soup," Chuck repeated, his tone unchanged but somehow carrying more weight. "And a sandwich. On a clean table." He gestured to where soup had spilled earlier. From behind the counter, Mike Wheeler finally found his voice. "Jason," he called, "do as the man says. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." A flush crept up Jason's neck. "I was just following policy," he muttered. "Though no such policy existed. We get people in here who can't pay all the time." Chuck's gaze never wavered. "This man can pay," he said simply. "You didn't give him the chance to eat what he ordered." The old man stood straighter, looking between Chuck and Jason with quiet dignity. "It's all right," he said. "I don't want special treatment." "It's not special treatment," Chuck replied, turning to him. "It's the treatment everyone deserves." Around the diner, a ripple of uncomfortable recognition passed through the patrons. Many had witnessed the waiter's behavior and said nothing. Some had even silently endorsed it. Now, faced with Chuck Norris's simple defense of dignity, their own silence felt conspicuous. Jason shifted his weight, suddenly aware that he had become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. "Fine," he said, attempting to sound nonchalant. "I'll get another soup." "And a sandwich," Chuck added, his voice mild but brooking no argument. "And a sandwich," Jason echoed, retreating toward the kitchen. Chuck turned to the old man. "Would you join me?" he asked, gesturing toward his corner booth. The old man hesitated, surprised by the invitation. "I wouldn't want to impose." "You wouldn't be," Chuck assured him. "I'd welcome the company." A murmur passed through the diner as Chuck Norris escorted the old man to his booth. Patrons exchanged glances, some embarrassed, others intrigued. The dynamic had shifted completely. The man who had been deemed unworthy of basic courtesy was now sitting with the most respected person in the room. In the kitchen, Louisa had already begun preparing a fresh bowl of soup before Jason arrived. "I heard," she said simply, ladling steaming broth into a clean bowl. "Turkey sandwich, too. And you'll serve it properly this time." Jason's face darkened, but he said nothing, aware that he'd lost whatever authority he'd imagined he had. At the counter, Mike Wheeler watched the scene unfold, with a mixture of concern and relief. Chuck Norris's intervention had averted a situation that could have escalated, but it had also exposed a problem in his own management. He should have stepped in sooner. He knew it, and now everyone in the diner knew it too. Chuck and the old man sat across from each other in the corner booth. The old man seemed slightly overwhelmed by the turn of events, his weathered hands resting on the table. Uncertain. "I'm Edward," he said finally, offering his name like a peace offering. "Edward Conroy." "Chuck," came the simple reply, accompanied by a nod of acknowledgement. "I know who you are, Mr. Norris," Edward said with a small smile. "I just didn't expect to meet you in a place like this." Chuck's expression softened slightly. "People are the same everywhere," he said. "Some good, some less so. Around them, The diner gradually resumed its normal rhythm, though conversations were more subdued, and many glances still turned their way. What had been a public humiliation was transforming into something else, a lesson in respect playing out before a captive audience. Jason emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of soup, a thick sandwich, and a glass of water. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by a careful precision as he approached the corner booth. He set the food down without a word, avoiding eye contact with both men. As he turned to leave, Chuck's voice stopped him. "Thank you," he said, the words simple but pointed. Jason paused, then gave a stiff nod before retreating to the kitchen. Edward looked down at the fresh meal before him, then back at Chuck. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "Yes," Chuck replied. "I did." Around them, the diner hummed with the subtle tension of a community confronting its own complicity. No one had stood up for Edward before Chuck arrived. Now, many found themselves wondering why they had remained silent. At a nearby table, a young mother whispered something to her daughter, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide, curious eyes. The girl nodded solemnly, absorbing a lesson more valuable than any lecture could provide. Edward picked up his spoon, his hands steadier now, and began to eat his soup with the methodical appreciation of someone who knew the value of a hot meal. Chuck sat in companionable silence, neither forcing conversation nor avoiding it. From the kitchen doorway, Jason watched, his expression a complex mixture of embarrassment, resentment, and dawning realization. The ease with which his behavior had been corrected made its wrongness all the more apparent. Mike Wheeler approached the booth, coffee pot in hand. "Refill?" he offered to Chuck, his manner respectful but slightly abashed, aware of his own failure to intervene. Chuck nodded, and Mike filled his cup. "And for you, sir?" he asked Edward. The "sir" deliberate and overdue. "Yes, please," Edward replied, the simple courtesy warming him as much as the soup. As Mike turned to leave, Chuck spoke again. "You run a good place here," he said. "Good food. Good people." The words were generous, but the implication was clear: what had happened wasn't worthy of the establishment or its owner. Mike nodded, accepting both the compliment and the gentle rebuke it contained. "We try to," he said. "Sometimes we fall short." "We all do," Chuck replied. "What matters is what we do next." Mike glanced toward the kitchen where Jason had disappeared. "Yes," he agreed. "What we do next." With that, he returned to the counter, his steps more purposeful than before. The diner continued its lunch service. But something had changed. A lesson had been delivered without a single raised voice or dramatic gesture, just the quiet insistence that dignity was not a privilege but a right, and that true strength lay in how we treated those with none. The soup before Edward had cooled to the perfect temperature, and he ate with the measured appreciation of a man who had known hunger. Each spoonful was deliberate, neither rushed nor lingering. Across the booth, Chuck sipped his coffee, comfortable in the shared silence. Other patrons still stole glances at their corner, some trying to capture discreet photos with their phones, others simply watching with quiet fascination. The novelty of Chuck Norris's presence was undeniable, but it was the unfolding human drama that held their attention. From the kitchen, Jason emerged again, carrying plates for another table. His earlier swagger had evaporated, replaced by a stiff professionalism. He delivered the food without his usual commentary, then hesitated, glancing toward the corner booth. For a moment, it seemed he might approach, perhaps to offer an apology. Instead, he retreated to the safety of the kitchen. "Been in town long?" Edward asked finally, breaking the companionable silence between them. Chuck set his coffee down. "Just passing through," he replied, Heading north to visit family. Edward nodded. I've lived here all my life, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. Worked at the factory for 43 years before they closed it down. His gnarled hands told the story, his words merely outlined years of hard work, of building something that ultimately hadn't lasted. Harder to retire than it used to be, Chuck observed, neither pitying nor dismissing. Never thought I'd be the kind to struggle, Edward admitted, his dignity intact, even in the confession. My generation was taught to save, to prepare, but medical bills change everything. He gestured to his leg. Hip replacement. Then, complications. Insurance only covers so much. At a nearby table, a middle-aged man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably, suddenly interested in his phone. He had been one of those who'd watched Edward's humiliation without intervening. Now he couldn't seem to look directly at the corner booth. I still come here once a week, Edward continued. A small luxury to remind myself I'm still part of things. He smiled slightly. Usually they're kinder about it. Chuck nodded, understanding the importance of such rituals. A good meal among people, he said simply. That matters. A young couple entered the diner, holding hands and laughing softly between themselves. The hostess seated them at a booth near the window, and they immediately leaned toward each other, wrapped in the private world that new love creates. Their arrival shifted the diner's energy slightly, introducing a note of lightness that had been missing since the earlier confrontation. Edward watched them for a moment, a fleeting shadow of nostalgia crossing his weathered features. My Elaine and I used to come here every Friday night, he said quietly. For almost 50 years. Chuck's expression softened slightly. She's gone? Edward nodded, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his coffee cup. 3 years this May. Cancer. The word held the weight of months of hospital rooms, of hope rising and falling, of final goodbyes. We met right here, actually. 1963. I'd just started at the factory. She was waitressing to put herself through secretary school. From across the diner, the young couple's laughter drifted toward them carefree, unburdened by knowledge of the fragility that underlies all happiness. She'd have liked you, Edward added with the hint of a smile. Always did have a thing for the strong, silent type. Chuck returned the smile, a rare, full expression that transformed his typically stoic features. Sounds like a woman of good judgment. The best, Edward agreed. He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. I'm not looking for charity, he said after swallowing. Never have been. I still have my pride. Even if it's about all I have left sometimes. Pride and dignity aren't the same thing, Chuck observed quietly. One we claim for ourselves, the other we owe each other. The conversation paused as Mike Wheeler approached their table again, coffee pot in hand. How's everything? He asked, his manner more solicitous than before. Very good, thank you, Edward replied, with genuine appreciation. Mike nodded, refilling their cups without being asked. On the house today, gentlemen, he said. I insist. Edward straightened, that pride Chuck had mentioned evident in his posture. That's not necessary, he began. It's not charity, Mike assured him quickly. It's an apology. What happened earlier, that's not how we do things here. Not how we should. Anyway. He glanced toward the kitchen. Jason's new. That's no excuse. But I want you to know he doesn't speak for this establishment. Chuck studied the diner owner with quiet assessment. Apology accepted, he said, though it hadn't been his to accept. But the words seemed to give Mike permission to direct his attention to Edward. "Mr. Conroy," Mike said, using the name he'd overheard earlier, "you've been coming here for years. You're welcome any time, understood? And if there's ever a problem again, you come directly to me." Edward's expression softened. "Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that." As Mike returned to the counter, a small girl of perhaps 5 or 6 approached their booth, trailing a worn stuffed rabbit by one ear. Her mother half rose from a nearby table, calling softly, "Sophie, come back here. Don't bother those gentlemen." The child ignored her mother, stopping directly in front of Chuck with the uncomplicated directness of the very young. "Are you really Chuck Norris?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight lisp of missing front teeth. The diner seemed to collectively hold its breath. Even Jason, emerging from the kitchen with plates balanced along his arm, paused to watch the interaction. Chuck turned to the girl, his expression softening into something rarely captured by cameras. "I am," he replied simply. The child nodded solemnly, as if confirming something she'd already known. "My daddy says you're the strongest man in the world." A small smile tugged at the corner of Chuck's mouth. "Is that so?" She nodded again. Then, with the lightning, quick subject changes of childhood, gestured toward Edward. "Is he your grandpa?" Edward chuckled softly at the question, but there was warmth in the sound, rather than offense. "No," Chuck replied. "But he's my friend." The child considered this for a moment, then declared with absolute certainty, "He looks nice. Like my grandpa, but taller." "Sophie," her mother called again, now standing and approaching with an apologetic expression. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Norris. She just slipped away." "No harm done," Chuck assured her, nodding to the little girl who was now showing her stuffed rabbit to Edward, explaining in great detail about its adventures. The mother hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I just wanted to say what you did earlier, standing up for him." She nodded toward Edward. "It was good. More people should be like that." Chuck studied her for a moment, then said simply, "Like you're teaching her to be." The woman's cheeks flushed slightly at the unexpected compliment. "Trying to," she admitted. "It's not always easy in a small town where everyone has opinions about how you should raise your kids." "Worth the effort," Chuck replied, with quiet certainty. Sophie, having completed her rabbit's life story for Edward, turned back to Chuck. "Can you sign my bunny? His name is Hoppy." Her mother began to object, but Chuck was already accepting the worn stuffed animal with the solemnity the request deserved. "Do you have a pen?" he asked the child. The mother fumbled in her purse, producing a blue ballpoint, which she handed to Chuck with a murmured thanks. He carefully signed the rabbit's worn foot, handling the cherished toy with respect. "There you go," he said, returning Hoppy to Sophie. "Take good care of him." Sophie clutched the rabbit to her chest, beaming. "I will. Thank you." She turned to Edward, adding with the impulsive generosity of childhood, "You can pet him if you want. He's very soft." Edward accepted this honor with appropriate gravity, gently patting the rabbit's head. "He's wonderful," he assured her. "Thank you for introducing us." The mother gently guided her daughter back toward their table, Sophie waving over her shoulder as they went. The small interaction had shifted something in the diner's atmosphere, a reminder of innocence and simple kindness amid the more complex adult dynamics at play. The bell above the door chimed as an elderly couple entered, making their way slowly to a table by the window. The woman walked with a cane, her husband's hand at her elbow offering subtle support. They settled into their seats with the comfortable synchronicity of people who had moved in tandem for decades. Edward watched them with a flicker of recognition. The Hendersons, he murmured to Chuck. Martin worked at the factory too. Quality control department. They lost their son in Desert Storm. Chuck nodded, understanding the layers of connection in a small town where lives intertwined across generations, where history was shared rather than merely individual. Jason approached the Hendersons' table, order pad in hand. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable. Gone was the dismissive impatience he'd shown Edward earlier. Instead, he leaned down slightly to be heard better, his posture respectful, his attention fully present. Edward noted the change with quiet satisfaction. Quick learner, he observed. When the lesson matters, Chuck agreed. From across the diner, several patrons still watched their corner booth with discreet interest. Word had spread about what had happened earlier, and new arrivals cast curious glances their way. Alerted by whispers and significant looks from those who had witnessed the confrontation. I've become part of the floor show, Edward said with dry humor, noticing the attention. Fame is overrated, Chuck replied, with the certainty of experience. Edward took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. You know, when I was younger, I might have handled that waiter differently, he admitted. Had a bit of a temper in my day. But you get to my age, you start choosing your battles more carefully. Wisdom, Chuck observed. Or just tired bones, Edward countered with a small smile. Either way, I've learned there's usually not much point in fighting every slight. World's full of them, and I'd spend all my time being angry. Chuck nodded, understanding evident in his eyes. Picking your moments makes them count more. A comfortable silence settled between them again. The kind possible only between people who feel no need to fill every space with words. Around them, the diner's rhythm continued, coffee being poured. Orders called out, the muted conversations of other patrons, creating a gentle backdrop. Jason approached their table again, his body language telegraphing a new uncertainty. He stood for a moment, seemingly unable to find the right words, then simply set down 2 small plates and forks for the upcoming pie. Can I get you anything else? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. Edward looked up at the young man who had humiliated him earlier. Something passed across his face, not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of the young man's humanity despite his actions. No. Thank you, he said with simple dignity. This is plenty. Jason nodded stiffly. Then, after a moment's hesitation, spoke again. I apologize for earlier, he said, the words coming out awkwardly but seemingly sincere. It was unprofessional. And wrong. Chuck watched silently, allowing the moment to unfold without his intervention. This was between Jason and Edward now. Edward studied the young waiter thoughtfully. Thank you for saying so, he said finally. Neither absolution nor rejection. Just acknowledgement of the apology offered. Jason nodded again, then retreated, the lesson delivered more effectively than any scolding could have achieved. Fran returned with 2 generous slices of pie, golden apple and ruby cherry, both topped with a small scoop of vanilla ice cream already beginning to melt. Enjoy, gentlemen, she said with a wink before moving on to her other tables. Edward looked at the dessert with undisguised appreciation. I haven't had pie à la mode in years, he admitted. Chuck pushed the apple slice toward Edward. Life's too short to skip dessert, he said, taking the cherry for himself. As they ate their pie in companionable silence, the diner around them gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The lunch rush was winding down, with more people leaving than arriving. Staff began clearing tables, resetting them for the dinner service that would begin in a few hours. Through it all, the lesson remained, unspoken but undeniable. Respect wasn't something to be earned through status or appearance, but a fundamental dignity owed to every person. The Hendersons, finished with their meal, prepared to leave. As they passed the corner booth, Mrs. Henderson paused, resting her weight on her cane. "Edward," she said warmly. "Lovely to see you out and about." Edward half rose from his seat. "Margaret. Martin. Good to see you both." Martin Henderson's gaze shifted to Chuck, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "It's an honor, Mr. Norris." Chuck nodded in acknowledgement. "The honor's mine," he replied. "Edward was just telling me about your years at the factory." Martin straightened slightly at the mention. 41 years, he said with quiet pride. "Would have been more if they hadn't closed down." Martin was the best quality inspector they ever had, Edward told Chuck. Could spot a flaw in a casting from across the room. The two elderly men exchanged a look of shared history of long shifts and hard work, of pride in craftsmanship, of a way of life that had largely disappeared. "We should let you enjoy your pie," Margaret said after a moment. "But Edward, the church is having a potluck on Sunday. You should come. Bring that chess set of yours, the one you carved. Some of the younger folks would love to learn." Edward nodded, his expression warming at the invitation. "I might just do that," he said. "Thank you, Margaret." As the Hendersons made their way toward the door, Edward turned back to Chuck. "See? Not everyone in town is like that waiter," he said. Though there was no need to convince Chuck of this. "Good people everywhere," Chuck agreed. "Sometimes they just need reminding to act like it." Edward took another bite of his pie, savoring it. "You know, I carved that chess set she mentioned during my recovery," he said. "After the hip surgery. Doctor said I needed something to keep my hands busy, my mind occupied. Started with small pieces, worked up to more detailed ones." A hint of pride crept into his voice. "Came out pretty good if I do say so myself." "Creative work heals," Chuck observed. "That it does," Edward agreed. "Keeps a man connected to something larger than his troubles." From across the diner, the young couple was preparing to leave, the young man helping his companion with her coat in a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. They moved toward the door, hand in hand, their faces still turned toward each other, as if reluctant to break eye contact even for a moment. Edward watched them go, a complex emotion playing across his features. Happiness for their joy, perhaps, mixed with the bittersweet knowledge of life's impermanence. "Love's a fine thing," he said softly, more to himself than to Chuck. "Worth every risk, every heartbreak." Chuck followed his gaze to the departing couple. "Even knowing how it ends?" Edward's eyes, when they returned to Chuck, held a quiet certainty. "Especially knowing how it ends," he replied. "Makes every moment matter more." It was the wisdom of a man who had loved and lost, who had learned that life's greatest joys often carried the seeds of its deepest sorrows, and who had decided, deliberately and with full awareness, that the joy was worth the cost. Outside, afternoon sunlight slanted through the diner windows, casting long golden rectangles across the checkered floor. The day was beginning its slow transition toward evening, the shadows lengthening, the light taking on the amber quality of approaching sunset. Inside, two men from different worlds shared pie and coffee, connected by nothing more and nothing less than a mutual recognition of each other's humanity. A simple truth that, in a world increasingly defined by division, felt almost revolutionary. The pie plates had been cleared, leaving only coffee cups on the table between Chuck and Edward. Their conversation had meandered comfortably, touching on everything from fishing spots in the area to the changes they'd both witnessed over decades of living. Age had given them common ground that transcended their different circumstances. Across the diner, Jason worked with a new attentiveness, his earlier disdain replaced by something approaching professionalism. Each time he passed near their booth, his eyes flickered toward them briefly, as if measuring the distance between the person he'd been and the person he might become. Mike Wheeler had emerged from his office again, taking a more active role on the floor than usual. He stopped at several tables, checking on customers personally, reclaiming his diner's atmosphere one conversation at a time. The lunch crowd had thinned considerably. Only a few tables remained, occupied a pair of elderly women sharing a late meal by the window, a businessman lingering over coffee and his laptop, and a young mother trying to keep her toddler entertained while she finished her lunch. Into this calmer atmosphere, 3 young men entered, bringing with them the boisterous energy of youth with too little supervision. They were in their early 20s, dressed in the uniform of small-town rebelliousness, torn jeans, graphic t-shirts, and an air of deliberate disregard for social niceties. "Yo, Mike!" called the tallest of them, ignoring the "please wait to be seated" sign. "Hook us up with the corner booth." Mike approached them with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good to see you boys," he said, though his tones suggested otherwise. "That booth is occupied right now. How about one over by the window?" The young man craned his neck, spotting Chuck and Edward in the corner. His eyes narrowed slightly, focusing on Edward's worn clothing. "Seriously? You're giving prime real estate to—" He stopped himself. But the implication was clear. "I can seat you by the window," Mike repeated, his voice firmer. "Or, you can come back another time." For a moment, it seemed the young man might argue. But then he shrugged. "Whatever. Window's fine." He gestured to his friends, and they followed Mike to a booth across the diner, but not without casting curious glances toward the corner. Edward, noticing the attention, shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should be going," he said quietly to Chuck. "I've taken enough of your time." Chuck shook his head slightly. "No rush," he replied. "Unless you have somewhere to be." Edward smiled wryly. "Nowhere that can't wait," he admitted. "Tuesday afternoons aren't exactly the height of my social calendar." A shadow of something not quite sadness, but a quiet recognition of life's solitary passages crossed his weathered features. For a moment, the mask of dignity slipped, revealing the loneliness beneath. "Since Elaine passed, the days can stretch long. Sometimes I walk downtown just to hear voices, to remember I'm still part of things." Chuck nodded, understanding evident in his eyes. He didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward sympathy, just the simple recognition that grief doesn't end. It merely changes form over time. Outside, clouds drifted across the sun, momentarily dimming the light through the diner's large windows. The brief shadow passed through the room like a silent reminder of time's passage, then brightened again as the sun emerged. Across the diner, the 3 young men settled into their booth, immediately spreading out as if to claim as much territory as possible. Their voices carried, deliberately louder than necessary, filled with the casual profanity of those who confuse crudeness with maturity. Jason approached their table, order pad in hand. The interaction was brief but notably different from how he'd treated Edward earlier. There was caution in Jason's demeanor now, a wariness that suggested he'd learned something valuable, if reluctantly. As Jason walked away with their order, the tallest young man called after him, "And make it snappy. Some of us have places to be." The comment drew irritated glances from the few remaining patrons. The businessman closed his laptop with a decisive click and signaled for his check, clearly unwilling to endure the disruption. Edward watched the scene with quiet resignation. "Some things never change," he observed. "I was probably like that at their age, though I'd like to think I had better manners." Chuck's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight tightening around his eyes as he monitored the young men's behavior. "Youth excuses energy," he said, "not disrespect." The three continued their disruptive presence, laughing too loudly at jokes only they found funny, making comments about other customers just audible enough to be offensive without being directly confrontational. "Check out Grandpa over there," the tallest one said, his voice carrying deliberately across the diner. "Bet he's boring that guy to death with stories about the good old days." His friends snickered, emboldened by his behavior. The shortest of the three, trying to keep up, added, "Yeah, and what's with those clothes?" Goodwill rejected that jacket twice. The young mother at a nearby table gathered her toddler closer, frowning at the young men before signaling to Fran for her check. The elderly women by the window exchanged glances, their enjoyment of their meal clearly diminished. Edward kept his eyes on his coffee cup, his expression carefully neutral, but the slight stiffening of his shoulders betrayed his awareness of being the target of their mockery. "Perhaps it is time for me to go," he said quietly to Chuck. Before Chuck could respond, the diner's atmosphere shifted as Jason approached their booth. The young waiter, who hours earlier had been the source of disrespect, now stood protectively near Edward, coffee pot in hand. "More coffee, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice pointedly louder than necessary, a clear signal to the three young men that their comments hadn't gone unnoticed. "Yes? Thank you," Edward replied, surprised by the unexpected alliance. Jason filled both cups, then turned slightly toward the three troublemakers. "Just so you know," he said, voice carrying easily across the now quiet diner, "Mr. Conroy here worked at the factory for 43 years. Probably built half the equipment your daddies use to put food on your tables." The tallest young man's face darkened. "Nobody asked you, waiter. Boy. Just bring our food and mind your own business." Jason's hand tightened around the coffee pot handle. For a moment, it seemed he might escalate the situation further. Instead, he took a deep breath and turned back to Chuck and Edward. "Let me know if you need anything else," he said. The deliberate professionalism in his voice, a stark contrast to his earlier behavior with Edward. As Jason walked away, the tall young man called after him, "Hey! What's the special treatment for? That old guy tipping you with his Social Security check?" The diner fell silent, the crude comment hanging in the air like smoke. Even the young man's friends looked uncomfortable now, exchanging uneasy glances. Mike Wheeler emerged from the kitchen, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his gaze moving between Jason and the three young men. "No problem," Jason replied, "just making sure our valued customers are taken care of." The emphasis he placed on valued was subtle but unmistakable. The three young men exchanged glances, sensing the shift in dynamics but unwilling to back down completely. "Whatever," the tall one muttered. "Just hurry up with our order." As Jason and Mike returned to the kitchen, Edward shook his head slightly. "You don't need to fight my battles," he said to no one in particular, though the words carried to those nearby. It was then that Chuck Norris finally spoke, his voice neither raised nor aggressive, yet somehow filling the diner completely. "Respect isn't a battle," he said. "It's a choice we make every day." The three young men froze, their attention snapping to the corner booth as recognition dawned on their faces. "Holy shit," the shortest one whispered, not quite quietly enough. "That's Chuck Norris." The tall one, trying to maintain his bravado, scoffed unconvincingly. "So what? He's just some old action star." Chuck stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He placed his napkin on the table, then turned fully toward the three young men. He didn't approach them. Didn't need to. His presence alone commanded the complete attention of everyone in the diner. "When I was your age," he said, his voice measured and clear, My grandfather taught me that a man's character isn't measured by how he treats those who can give him something. It's measured by how he treats those who can give him nothing. The words settled over the diner like a gentle weight, pressing against consciences, stirring memories of lessons taught by parents and grandparents, but perhaps forgotten in the rush to adulthood. The young men stared, caught between their desire to appear unimpressed and their obvious awe at being directly addressed by Chuck Norris. "That man you're mocking," Chuck continued, nodding toward Edward, "built this town with his hands while you were still in diapers. He deserves your respect not because of who he is, but because of who you should be." The diner remained silent, every ear tuned to Chuck's words. Even the kitchen staff had paused, standing in the doorway to listen. The tall young man shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado evaporating. "We were just joking around," he muttered, not meeting Chuck's gaze. "Humor at someone else's expense isn't humor," Chuck replied evenly. "It's cruelty wearing a mask." The middle friend, who had been mostly silent until now, spoke up hesitantly. "My grandpa worked at the factory," he admitted. "Said it was the hardest job he ever had. Best too." Edward looked up at that, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "What was his name?" he asked. "Thomas Bauer," the young man replied. Recognition dawned on Edward's face. "Tommy Bauer. Maintenance department. Good man." The connection formed a thread between them, a shared history that transcended the current tension. The diner had fallen completely silent. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed muted, as if the building itself was listening. "I'm not here to lecture you," Chuck continued, his tone unchanged. "You're young men, not children. Old enough to know better. Old enough to do better." The three friends exchanged glances, their earlier cockiness replaced by genuine discomfort. The middle one, Thomas Bauer's grandson, spoke up again. "We didn't mean anything by it," he said, his tone defensive but uncertain. "Intentions matter less than actions," Chuck replied, "and actions less than the willingness to correct them." Edward stood now too, moving to Chuck's side with quiet dignity. "It's all right," he said, addressing both Chuck and the young men. "They're young. We all make mistakes when we're young." There was no condescension in his voice, only the gentle wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand that growth often begins with humility. The three young men looked at Edward with new eyes, seeing for the first time not just an old man in worn clothes, but a person with dignity and grace that transcended appearance. The diner held its collective breath, waiting. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, it could still tip toward conflict or resolution. The tall one hesitated, then stood, approaching their booth with uncertain steps. "I apologize, sir," he said to Edward, the "sir" coming naturally now. "We were out of line." Edward nodded, accepting the apology with simple dignity. "Thank you," he said. "That takes courage." The young man glanced at Chuck, then back to Edward. "My grandfather worked at the factory too," he admitted. "He always said it was the best job he ever had." "What was his name?" Edward asked, genuine interest in his voice. "James Harmon." Edward's face brightened with recognition. "Jimmy Harmon. Of course. He worked in assembly. Good man, steady hands." He looked more closely at the young man's face. "I can see it now. You have his eyes." The connection formed a bridge across generations, transforming strangers into neighbors with shared history. The air in the diner seemed to lighten, the tension dissolving like morning mist under sunlight. The other two young men approached now, offering their own awkward but sincere apologies. What had begun as confrontation was transforming into connection, not through force or even authority, but through the simple power of mutual respect. Chuck observed it all with quiet satisfaction. The lesson delivered not through his reputation or physical presence, but through the moral authority that came from standing for what was right. The shortest of the young men, who had remained mostly quiet, finally spoke up. "My name's Kevin," he said, extending his hand to Edward. "Kevin Miller." Edward took the offered hand. "Any relation to Frank Miller?" "He ran the hardware store for years." Kevin nodded, surprise evident on his face. "He was my great-uncle." "How'd you know?" "Same chin," Edward said with a small smile. "Frank helped me pick out my first real tool set back in '65. Good man, fair prices." The conversation expanded, histories intertwining as names were exchanged and connections discovered. This was small-town America, at its best, where family trees intertwined, where one generation's actions rippled through to the next, where shared history created bonds that transcended momentary conflicts. Around them, the diner seemed to exhale collectively. The elderly women by the window nodded in approval. The young mother, who had been preparing to leave, settled back into her seat. Even the businessman who had closed his laptop reopened it. The atmosphere once again conducive to remaining. Mike Wheeler, watching from near the kitchen, caught Chuck's eye and nodded a gesture of gratitude and respect that acknowledged what had been accomplished without a single raised voice or threatening gesture. Fran approached with fresh coffee for everyone, her efficient movements somehow conveying approval of the scene unfolding before her. "On the house," she said simply, filling cups all around. The tall young man James, named after his grandfather, looked at Chuck with a mixture of embarrassment and admiration. "I've seen all your movies," he admitted. "My dad and I used to watch them together." Chuck nodded in acknowledgement, but deliberately turned the conversation back to Edward. "Tell them about the factory," he suggested, "what it was like in its prime." Edward straightened slightly, pride evident in his posture as he began to speak of the days when the factory employed half the town, when American manufacturing was at its height, when a job meant not just a paycheck but an identity, a community. The young men listened with surprising attention, drawn into a history they had previously dismissed as irrelevant. Questions emerged, genuine ones, about what the work was like, about how things had changed, about what had been lost in the transition to a service economy. Outside, the afternoon light had begun its slow shift toward evening, casting longer shadows through the diner windows. Time seemed suspended as bridges formed between generations, as respect replaced mockery, as the simple human connection that comes from truly seeing one another unfolded in a corner of a small-town diner. Jason approached with the young men's food, but instead of interrupting, he simply set it down at an empty table nearby and slipped away, allowing the conversation to continue unbroken. It was a small gesture, but significant, an acknowledgement that what was happening was more important than routine, that some moments deserve space to unfold naturally. Chuck remained present but gradually stepped back from the center of the interaction, allowing Edward and the young men to connect directly, his role shifting from catalyst to witness. This, perhaps, was the true measure of his strength, not the ability to dominate a situation, but the wisdom to know when to step aside and let others find their own way forward. The three young men pulled chairs up to the corner booth, transforming the space from a potential battleground to a place of unexpected community. Edward, animated now by their interest, gestured as he described the massive machines that once filled the factory floor, the precise choreography of the assembly line, the pride that came from seeing products stamped with the town's name shipped across the country. "That factory built more than pumps and motors," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "It built families, homes, futures. Your grandfathers understood that. They weren't just punching a clock, they were building something that mattered. The young men nodded, absorbing a perspective that had been missing from their understanding of the town's history, of their own family histories. Something was shifting in them, not dramatically, not completely, but perceptibly. A seed of respect planted where before there had been only dismissal. True strength, the diner had witnessed, wasn't measured in the ability to dominate or intimidate. It was measured in the courage to stand for dignity, both your own and others, even when it would be easier to remain silent. The confrontation had dissolved into something unexpected, a conversation that bridged generations. Edward and the young men, no longer adversaries but reluctant neighbors finding common ground, had moved to a larger table. They were joined by Jason, during his break, listening with surprising interest as Edward shared stories of the factory where many of their fathers and grandfathers had worked. "We used to make the best industrial pumps in 3 states, Edward was saying, his hands gesturing to show the scale. "Your grandfather," he nodded to the tall young man, "could assemble a P-40 faster than anyone on the floor. Had a trick to it that no one else could quite copy." The young man leaned forward, genuinely engaged. "He never really talked about his work," he admitted. "Just that it was honest and paid the bills." "That was Jimmy," Edward chuckled. "Never one to brag. But he had magic in his hands when it came to machinery." From his corner booth, Chuck watched the interaction with quiet satisfaction as he prepared to leave. He placed enough money on the table to cover both meals several times over. Then stood, putting on his hat with an unhurried motion. The afternoon light had softened, casting long golden rectangles across the diner floor. Dust motes danced in the slanting sunbeams, small galaxies suspended in the quiet air. Outside, the small town continued its daily rhythm, cars passing occasionally. Pedestrians moving with the unhurried pace of people who knew their destinations would wait. Chuck paused for a moment, taking in the scene that had unfolded in this ordinary place on an ordinary day. There was something profoundly American about it, not the America of headlines and politics, but the deeper current of community that still ran beneath the surface of towns like this one, sometimes forgotten but never quite gone. Mike Wheeler intercepted him before he could reach the door. "Mr. Norris," he said, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention, "I want to thank you for what you did today." Chuck shook his head slightly. "I didn't do anything special," he replied. "Just what needed doing." Mike glanced back at the diner, where Edward was now showing the young men and Jason something in his wallet, an old photo perhaps, or a memento from his working days. "You changed something here today," Mike said. "Not just for Mr. Conroy, but for all of us." "People know what's right," Chuck observed. "Sometimes they just need reminding." Mike nodded, accepting both the wisdom and the gentle rebuke it contained. "I should have stepped in sooner with Jason," he acknowledged. "Won't make that mistake again." "Then something good came of it," Chuck said, offering his hand. They shook, a simple gesture between men who understood that leadership wasn't about authority but example. "You know," Mike added after a moment, "my father opened this place in 1978. Used to tell me that a diner wasn't just a business, it was a community gathering place. Somewhere everyone should feel welcome." He looked around at his establishment with new eyes. "I think I'd lost sight of that somewhere along the way." Chuck followed his gaze. "Not lost," he corrected gently. "Just misplaced for a while." At the counter, Fran approached with a paper bag. "For the road," she said, handing it to Chuck with a warm smile. "Slice of pie and a sandwich. Long drive ahead, I imagine." Chuck accepted the offering with a nod of thanks. "Very kind of you." "Least we could do," Fran replied. You've given us something to talk about for months." Chuck smiled slightly. "Hope it's the lesson, not just the story." "Oh, it will be," Fran assured him, glancing back at the diner. "Some things stick. This will." The elderly women who had been seated by the window approached, both wearing the slightly odd expressions of people encountering an unexpected celebrity. "Mr. Norris," the taller one said, her white hair perfectly styled. "I just wanted to say that what you did for Edward today was wonderful. He's been having a difficult time since his Elaine passed." Her companion nodded in agreement. "This town doesn't always remember its own," she added. "Too busy looking forward to remember who built the foundation we're standing on." Chuck acknowledged their words with a respectful nod. "Sometimes we all need reminding of what matters," he said simply. The women beamed at him, clearly charmed. "My grandson won't believe I met you," the shorter one confided. "He's seen all your movies at least twice." "Tell him hello from me," Chuck replied with gentle courtesy. As the women moved away, clearly delighted with the encounter, Chuck turned back toward the door. The young mother with the toddler was preparing to leave as well, gathering her child and diaper bag with the practiced efficiency of parenthood. She paused when she saw Chuck, shifting her daughter to her hip. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing that standing up for others doesn't have to mean making a scene or starting a fight. It's a good lesson for her to see, even if she's too young to understand it now." The little girl, thumb in mouth, regarded Chuck with solemn eyes, unimpressed by his fame, but somehow sensing his kindness. "She'll remember," Chuck said, gently touching the child's hand. "Children absorb more than we realize." The mother nodded, gratitude in her eyes, then continued toward the door, her daughter looking back over her shoulder at Chuck until they disappeared outside. As Chuck turned to leave, Edward noticed his movement and excused himself from the table of young men. He approached Chuck with an extended hand. "I'm not sure how to thank you properly," Edward said as they shook hands. "No thanks necessary," Chuck replied. "I'm glad things worked out." Edward's weathered face creased in a genuine smile. "More than worked out," he said. "Those boys asked if I'd be here next Tuesday. Said they'd like to hear more about the old days." He shook his head in bemused wonder. "Imagine that." "They're not bad kids," Chuck observed. "Just needed perspective. Don't we all from time to time?" Edward agreed. Then, more seriously, "What you did today, standing up for a stranger, that's rare. Rarer than it should be." Chuck adjusted his hat slightly. "Maybe next time it won't be so rare," he said, nodding toward the rest of the diner. "Seems to me there are plenty of good people here. Sometimes good people just need to be reminded to act like it." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "You know, after Elaine died, I started to feel invisible. Like I'd faded out of the world somehow." He glanced back at the young men, who were waiting respectfully for his return. "Today was the first time in a long while I've felt seen." "You were never invisible," Chuck replied. "Just overlooked. There's a difference." "Well, whatever it was, it's changed now," Edward said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden object, a chess piece, a knight, carved with remarkable detail despite its small size. "I'd like you to have this," he said, offering it to Chuck. "I carved it during my recovery last year. Whole set at home, but this one seems right for you." Chuck accepted the gift with genuine appreciation, turning the small knight in his fingers, feeling the smooth wood polished by careful craftsmanship. "Fine work," he said, the simple praise clearly meaning more to Edward than any effusive compliment could have. "Been working with wood since I was a boy," Edward replied with quiet pride. Hands aren't as steady as they once were, but they still know what to do. Chuck carefully tucked the chess piece into his pocket. "I'll treasure it," he said, and meant it. Edward stepped back, straightening his shoulders. "Safe travels," he said finally, allowing Chuck to leave. "Until next time," Chuck replied with a slight nod. Around them, the diner had settled into a new rhythm, not quite the same as before, but somehow more harmonious. Jason moved between tables with a new attentiveness, his earlier disdain replaced by genuine service. The three young men, having ordered their meal, ate with markedly better manners. Even the elderly women by the window seemed to sit straighter, as if the entire establishment had collectively decided to rise to a higher standard. "One more thing," Edward said as Chuck turned toward the door. "What made you step in when no one else would?" Chuck considered the question for a moment. "My father taught me that a man who stands by while another is humiliated shares in the shame," he said finally. "I was just honoring his lesson." Edward nodded, understanding. "Good lesson." "The best," Chuck agreed. "Taught me that strength isn't about what you can do to others, it's about what you can do for them." As he opened the door, the bell above it chimed, drawing glances from throughout the diner. Several patrons nodded in recognition or raised hands in silent farewell. Chuck acknowledged them with a simple tip of his hat, then stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight. Through the window, they watched him walk to his truck, nothing flashy, just a reliable American-made pickup, and drive away without fanfare or spectacle. Yet his impact remained, lingering in the diner, like the warmth of a hearth long after the fire has died down. Inside, life continued. Fran delivered checks to tables. Mike adjusted the thermostat. Jason cleared dishes with new care and precision. Edward returned to the young men, resuming his stories of the town's better days. But something fundamental had shifted. A small lesson in dignity had unfolded in their presence, and each person who witnessed it carried a piece of it with them. The businessman who had watched silently left a larger tip than usual. The young mother spoke to her toddler with more patience. The elderly women stopped to speak with Edward on their way out, introducing themselves as former secretaries at the factory where he'd worked. Small changes, perhaps insignificant in isolation, but together, they represented something profound. The quiet power of example, the contagious nature of respect, the way one person's courage can awaken it in others. Later that evening, as Mike Wheeler closed up the diner, he paused by the corner booth where it had all unfolded. He ran his hand along the table's surface, as if some essence of the day's events might still linger there. "Everything all right, boss?" Jason asked, looking up from where he was sweeping the floor. Mike nodded slowly. "You know, my father opened this place in 1978, he said. "Always told me a good diner was more than just a place to eat. Said it was the heart of a community." Jason leaned on his broom, listening with unexpected attentiveness. "I think I forgot that somewhere along the way," Mike continued. "Started seeing it as just a business." He looked around the empty diner, seeing it with new eyes. "But it's more than that. It's where people come to be seen, to be part of something. Everyone who walks through that door deserves the same respect, whether they're wearing a three-piece suit or threadbare jeans." Jason nodded, his earlier arrogance nowhere in evidence. "I get it now," he said quietly. "Won't forget again." "Neither will I," Mike replied. Outside, twilight painted the small town in gentle blues and purples. Streetlights flickered on, one by one. People headed home to families, to empty houses, to various versions of lives being lived. Some would remember the day's events. Others would hear about them secondhand. The story would spread, as stories do in small towns, growing slightly with each telling. But beneath the inevitable embellishments, the core truth would remain: that dignity isn't something we earn through status or appearance, but a fundamental right we owe each other as human beings. That true strength isn't measured by domination but by the courage to stand for what's right, even when it would be easier to remain silent. And that sometimes, the most powerful statement isn't made through force or volume, but through the quiet authority of doing what others only wish they had the courage to do. In a world often filled with noise and spectacle, it had taken Chuck Norris, a man famous for both, to remind them of the power of quiet dignity. And in a small diner, in a forgotten corner of America, that lesson would endure long after the day's special had changed and the coffee had gone cold. Because some lessons, once learned, change not just moments but lives. Not with a roundhouse kick, but with the far more powerful force of simple human decency. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.